All right. So as Jenna said, today we'll be talking about the Migrate tools in Drupal. Um, as typical, I'm sure I'm going to try and cover way too much information in the time we have, but I hope everyone will get something out of this, whether you're a complete beginner or you've been using Drupal's Migrate system for a while. So let's jump right in. So, like Jenna said, my name is Joel Steidl. I'm Aten's VP of Engineering. I've been with Aten for about 15 years now and using Drupal for about the same time. Um, I do enjoy things outside of the Drupal world. So here's a picture of myself with my family. We got to go see a soccer game here in Denver a couple weeks ago. Uruguay versus Mexico. It was really fun, and I love getting out in the mountains. All right, enough about me. Let's jump right in. So, what is the Drupal Migrate API? It has a whole bunch of different names. The Migrate module, uh, the technical name for it is the Migrate API. What you should know about it, it's part of Drupal core. So that means that it ships out of the box with Drupal. The Migrate API is is implemented as ETL processes. You've maybe heard that before, even outside of the Drupal realm. It's kind of like common terminology. ETL stands for extract, transform, and load. And in the case of the Migrate API, extract are your source plugins. And I'll talk about source plugins are kind of like what informs Drupal of where to get the data from. So that might be a MySQL database, like an existing Drupal website, an old, say, a Drupal 7 site, or JSON data, or CSV data, or whatever. And then transform or our migrate calls are process plugins. That's the ability to transform data. I have some really simple examples of what that means. Essentially, in the transform step, it's whatever the value is. So let's just say we're migrating from a CSV file, and we wanted to replace all spaces with dashes. Well, we could do that in a process plugin. And then lastly, our load, our destination plugin. This is one that we actually don't have to touch all that often. This is essentially stating where we want to migrate our data to in Drupal. So, of course, a lot of times that's migrating into an entity such as a node or a user or a taxonomy term. All right, it can be used for moving into data into Drupal once. So, let's just say you're doing a big site migration. You could do that one time, right? And you're kind of done with it at that point. Once the data is in, you rely on Drupal's edit forms to make your edits moving forward. And then it can be used for repeating data syncs, which is one of the superpowers of it. All right, why you should use it. If you need to get a large amount of data into Drupal in an automated way, look no further. It's the best tool for the job, hands down. It's extremely fast to set up. I'll kind of hopefully demonstrate some of that today. It keeps track of what has been migrated, so you can do things like easily roll back a migration. So meaning, let's just say we're creating a bunch of nodes in Drupal from our migration. We can actually roll all that back if we notice major issues. Or if we get fresh data or need to make changes to how we're transforming the data, we can easily update what's already been migrated into Drupal. Already mentioned the flexible data sources is great. I think often we think of Drupal's Migrate API as like your ability to go from one version of Drupal to the next. Thankfully, this hasn't been as necessary from Drupal 8 to 9 to 10. But if you're coming over from say Drupal 7 to Drupal 10, the Migrate API is going to be your best friend. And then, of course, modifying data is really simple with process plugins. This allows for a lot of creativity on how you can use those. I've done all sorts of things with process plugins, probably things you shouldn't do in process plugins, but I love how creative you can be with them. And I'll show off some examples during the webinar. All right, a couple hurdles, right? I will probably make the Migrate API sound like it can do anything and has zero, potential issues. Some things can make migrating in data really difficult. So embeds like WordPress shortcodes, or if you're coming from a previous version of Drupal and you had things like, Drupal media in Drupal 7, for example, that's where you'll have to get creative. There's a lot of helpful process plugins that exist as Drupal modules out there that will help you handle things like that, but it's just something to be aware of. Another thing to be aware of is overly complex or dirty HTML. Let's say you're migrating over from a site where someone copied and pasted from Microsoft Word a lot. However that content existed, that's how it's going to come over. And if you start trying to clean that stuff up in a migration script, that could be potentially difficult. Extremely abstracted data structures or very relational data. It can be done. It will just be time consuming in how it has to be set up. The Migrate API is actually set up to handle relational data fairly well, but it can really add some complexity to your migrations. And just a note here, if you're migrating from a previous version of Drupal or another content management system, you can count on some level of manual cleanup. Migration's really the first step. I think a lot of times this catches our clients off guard is the amount of work that may be necessary from content authors once the content is over into, say, Drupal 10. All right, I'm going to make a few assumptions here just because I have such limited time on how much I can cover today. So I'm going to make assumptions about your general Drupal knowledge. I'll be talking about Composer a little bit, which is, Drupal's PHP-based package manager. Drush, which is Drupal's command line utility. If you're doing any sort of migration work, Drush is really incredible because it allows you to run the migrations and get some visual feedback quickly on what that looks like. I actually never run migrations through the Drupal user interface, even though you can. And then I'm using Lando just because it was really fast to set up, but that's my local development environment. So it allows me to run Drupal on my local computer. In a second, we'll take a look at the modules I've enabled. And then generally, you'll want to create a custom module when migrating data, and we'll be looking at that quite a bit today. The custom module that I've created for this webinar. All right, so we'll get hands-on with stuff. We'll look at the general structure of a Migrate custom Drupal module. We'll look at migrating from a JSON source, migrating from a CSV. Some of these I'll breeze through because the concepts are really kind of the same after you get into it. And if time allows, we'll look at migrating from my custom MySQL database, and then we'll look at creating and leveraging Migrate process plugins. So we have a ton to get through. Let's dive right in. And if I'm going to try to leave some time for questions at the end. If you have anything burning, feel free to post it. And even if I can't get to you today in the webinar, I would be happy to follow up with you. All right, so I'm going to exit out of the slideshow here. I'm going to go to my Drupal site that I have running. So this is a pretty vanilla, just Drupal 10 site. Again, I'm running that on Lando, and I'm on the extend page here. And I just want to show you some stuff I have enabled here. So I have Migrate, Migrate Drupal. Those both come with Drupal core. So again, those were out of the box. I've got a few contributed modules. Migrate Plus is really handy. That allows us to migrate from like JSON and XML sources. It also comes with a lot of really useful process plugins. Migrate source CSV. So this allows us to migrate from a CSV source. And then, of course, our custom module here. So you can see there's not a whole lot going on. All right, let's dive in and take a look at our custom module that I've created here. All right, let me close a few things here. So in my site, we're looking, this is just all the files with Drupal here. I've got our contrib modules, which are those three modules I just listed: Migrate File, Migrate Plus, and Migrate Source CSV. I added all of those with Composer and then just enabled the modules. And then for my webinar Migrate module, I actually created that with, if you haven't used Drush too much, you can run like Lando Drush generate. And generate has so many different options. I'll actually show a few today, but I actually use the generate module, which is one of the options here, to create our custom module. A custom module is really easy to create, but that's a shortcut if you're not familiar with it. So quickly, let's look at what our custom module has here. So first off, we have this migrations directory that contains all our YAML files. So if you're not familiar with YAML in Drupal, it's kind of a simple text format that usually contains configurations. So it's a set of, set of instructions for Drupal on what to do with certain things. When I'm creating custom migrations, I love doing it this way because I can drop my migrations in my custom module here, and I don't have to deal with Drupal's configuration system at that point. So I don't have to deal with importing configuration and exporting configuration as these migrations change. I can simply come in, make a change, clear Drupal's cache, and then continue testing or continue running migrations. All right, the other thing we'll notice is the SRC directory here. We have nested underneath that, we have plugin and migrate. So everything in the migrate ecosystem is considered to be a plugin. Again, we can use Drush to generate those plugins, and hopefully I'll show an example of that in a bit. But you could see I've got two different ones here. I've got process and source. So you can, a source plugin would be when you need to migrate from a source that's not already available through a module. So The quick example for that would be if you're migrating from a custom MySQL database, that would be a good uh, that's probably when you would introduce a custom source plugin. Again, I had Drush generate that for me. All right, so there's our module, really straightforward. In my utils directory, I simply just have a CSV file that I'm using to migrate from. So nothing to speak of there. All right, let's jump right in. So we're gonna start with migrating from our JSON source here. And again, this is provided by the Migrate Plus module, the source. Let me kind of break down a Migrate YAML file for you. There's a lot of great documentation on this, like all over the web. So I don't want to get too bogged down on this part, or I'll use all our time. But I'll quickly talk through the important pieces of this file. ID is very important. That's how your migration is referenced when you are running your migrations. That just needs to be unique. You can call it anything you want. A label, I like to just, stay organized, let people know what it's for. And then tags are really handy because if you're doing a lot of migrations, you can tag your migrations various ways. So for today, you could say I just tagged it as webinar. You could add additional ones here. So maybe we say this is a node migration that allows you to do things like run migrations in a batch. So we could target all our node migrations at once, depending on how you use the tags. All right, our source. So this is where we're defining what our source plugin is. Typically, at a minimum, a source plugin would have a plugin name. So in this case, plugin, that's kind of like the bare minimum that you would have in some cases. I'm just going to comment that out so you can kind of see it. And you'll see this as we go on with the webinar. Some source plugins have different configuration that you can pass in. In this particular case, the URL plugin allows us to define a data fetcher plugin. And I think the two options are like file and then HTTP. HTTP just simply means it's going to be from a remote source or a remote URL. And then our parser plugin, I think out of the box, the ones you get are XML or JSON. In this case, so we're using our HTTP. So we have this URL property here. So that's where we define where our data is coming from. Just to show you what that looks like here, I have Postman up, which is just a really simple tool. You can see I posted in the URL here, and this is the data that we're getting back, right? So this is helpful when you're like doing a JSON migration to kind of see what you're dealing with. But just to give you an idea of like the data that we're using in this particular migration. All right, so this particular Migrate source plugin allows us to define our item selector. So the item selector just simply means like what are the common pieces of data that we need to like migrate one at a time. Like if you think about in this case, if we go back and look in our data here, we have an array of teams, and I want to migrate in each team. So I set up teams as my selector. So that's where it's going to look for multiple teams. And then I've defined our fields here. And the fields simply align to the, let's see here, the data here, the various properties in the JSON data. So we could access any of this: ID, name, short name, and you would of course adjust this accordingly with whatever you're migrating in. In this case, I had a few just small examples here. It's important to define whatever fields you want to use in your migrate script. The next piece is really important. Every migration has a unique identifier for each piece of content you're migrating in. And that's a unique identifier in the source data. So in our case, if we go back and look at the JSON, I noticed that each team had their own unique identifier. So that was perfect for this use case. You can see here, I have the type defined as an integer that can be a string. So you can really use anything you need as an identifier, but it has to be unique. All right, so that's our source. That's our source. And now we get into our process. The process is really, how are we transforming this data or getting it into our Drupal data structure? So in the process, this is really simple. On the left is whatever the property is named in Drupal. So I'm migrating this into a content type. So we know every node has a title, for example. And then on the right, that would be any of our available fields from up above. Just kind of ignore this is a more complex option here. Let's stay really focused on just title. So if we had another Drupal field that we're migrating in, it could be as simple, let's just say long title. So that would be our Drupal field name. And then we have access to using our name up above. So that's all you would have to do to define a new field in our migration here. I'm going to remove it. And then lastly, so you can add as many things on here as you want. So you can see I have field logo down here. And again, this is a more complicated piece of the migration. But you can add as many fields as you need to in this process section. And I'll show a little bit too about how you can run that through what's called a process plugin, or your ability to transform data. Then lastly, we have our destination. This is where the data is going to end up on the Drupal side. So plugin here, these plugins are provided by Drupal core. And just to give you an idea, some of the ones that you might commonly use, of course, entity node is very common. That would be anything that's a content type. You could use entity user if you're migrating in users, for example, or taxonomy term if you're doing a term migration. And then in some cases, if it's a content type that has bundles, this default bundle configuration option is important. So just to show you how this looks on the Drupal side of things, I'm going to click on structure here on my site, just so you can see I have a content type called team, right? That's my machine name for that content type. And so you can see here, I'm setting that as our default bundle. All right, so that's kind of the baseline of what makes up this file. And after you get that set up, here in a custom module, all you would need to do is run a cache clear. So I do that as a Lando Drush CR. The CR stands for cache rebuild. And now there's several ways that we can review this file. So I'm going to do a Lando migrate status. You can run ms as the shortcut for that. And then real simply, we could just add in the identifier of our migration here. So of course I did something wrong there. Or you can do it based on a tag. Gotta love the live demo nature of these things. And probably everyone's commenting, hey man, you forgot to write Drush in there. Well, you're right, I did. So now you can see our various migrations. In this case, we are concerned with our team's migration. We can see that there are 20 items, and that checks out. If we went back and looked at our source data here, we could do a count of teams and see that there are 20 teams. Or if you know the Premier League, you would know there are 20 teams in the Premier League. All right, so we can get a status of our migration. And then if we like, we can go ahead and run our migration in this case. So that's really simple to do. We can run Lando Drush, don't forget the Drush part, migrate import, and then the identifier of our migration. So this one will take a second because remember it's fetching our data from an external source, and we can see it running here. I love the visual feedback of doing that here and on the command line. So if we go back to our Drupal site now and click on content, I should have showed this previously. It's not like a baking show. I didn't already have this done. But now we have our various teams. So we've got our 20 teams in here. And let's just quickly, what if we wanted to change the title from the short name to the name? So if we looked in our data here, right, we can see that the name is different than the short name. So we got a request to make that change. So let's go ahead. All we need to do is swap out. Remember on the left, that's what you're migrating into Drupal as. On the right is where the identifier of that data in your source data. All right, so I've saved that. Remember, we have to clear cache anytime we make a change to these files, but that's far simpler than dealing with configuration, in my opinion. And so I can hit our up arrow and we can run this again. But the important thing is that we run that with an update flag. Before I do that, I want to show something here. So in the database, what Drupal is doing behind the scenes, let's go ahead and refresh here. For every migration you do, Drupal creates what's called a migrate map table. And so this can get more complex, but at a baseline, there are two columns that are really important. One, the source ID. So that's the identifier in your source data. This can be really helpful for like doing quality assurance or troubleshooting. And then destination is where that's getting migrated into on the Drupal side. So for example, we can see that Arsenal here, one of our teams, had an ID of 57. And we can see that got migrated into Drupal as node 1. And that could be handy because now we just know, like, we can type in node/1, and that's going to be Arsenal. All right. So that map table is very helpful. It also allows us to do things like run our update, and it knows what to update, right? So it's not going to create a new node in Drupal this time. It's going to update the ones that we already migrated in. And you can see how quick it is to do this, unless you're dealing with, of course, like thousands and thousands of pieces of content, but there are ways that you can do smaller batches of a migration. Now you can see that our title is Arsenal FC, and you can see how easy that is to make updates. Again, let's just say we completely mess things up. You could actually roll back that migration, and that's where this map table in the database comes in handy, because it knows which nodes to remove in Drupal that you migrated in. So you could easily do that by running migrate. I think it's rollback. I will always use the shortcuts, but and then of course the identifier here. And there we go. If we go back to our content, we'll see that that all of our teams have been removed now. No content available. All right, let's jump into another example here. So CSVs I wanted to include because it's such a helpful format, right? Like, and I'll just look it up real quick. Migrate CSV source. Migrate source CSV is the module I'm using for this one. So this is what's providing the source plugin that we can access in our migrate file. So a lot of stuff is going to look familiar here, right? So we've given it a unique identifier again. This time, instead of the plugin being URL, it's CSV. And then the CSV has its own unique configuration. So a path to your CSV file. In my case, I have a really simple one of states. So all the states and the abbreviations. So you can imagine that in a spreadsheet. Again, you have to give it a unique identifier. That's for that migrate map table that we just looked at. So in this case, I'm just using the state abbreviation. You have to define your fields, and that's based on the position of like the column in the spreadsheet. But any columns that you define here, you can then use in your process plugin. Just to change things up a little bit, you can see that this time I'm migrating into a taxonomy term called states. So if we go look at our taxonomy structure here in Drupal, I'm going to do list terms. We have no terms available. You can see when we ran our migrate status that it found 51 states in our CSV file. I think it includes like Washington, D.C. or something. All right, so we can use anything here in our, you can see I have a field called field abbreviation. That's just a field I created on that taxonomy. So just to explain that real quick, if we went to manage fields, you can see I have field abbreviation. It's just a real simple text field. Instead of using a process plugin this first time around, I'm just going to comment that out and say simply, I want the taxonomy term name to come directly from the state column in the CSV data. So I need to do a cache clear. All right, so we talked about how the source plugin's a little different this time around. Our process, of course, is going to be slightly different. Taxonomy term doesn't have title, for example. It's called name. The property is name. And then we have our field abbreviation. So to execute this, of course, we can simply do lando drush migrate import, and then do the name of our migration. All right, great. Now, if we go back to Drupal, we can list out those terms and see if it worked. I like the real-time, feedback you can get in this case, which is great. So we have all our states here in the District of Columbia. All right, let's start tapping into process plugins and the power of being able to transform data. Here in a minute, I'll look at how you generate one of these. But if you recall, a process plugin lives at source, plugin, and migrate, and in the process directory. Real quickly, so a lot of times in process plugins, you can see I've not done a good job of here, but typically a process plugin will be documented here in the annotation or in the code comment. And then this is where you define the identifier for the process plugin. That's very important. That needs to be a unique ID just for this plugin. But I'll show you how to create one of these files in a sec. And then transform is going to be our only method within this particular plugin. And the main thing to know is value. If we look down here, I'm going to uncomment what I just commented out here. So instead of just taking the raw value of state from our spreadsheet, we want to transform that now. And you can do that by way of documenting our that we're using a plugin. So you can see here I've simply tabbed in a level and I've said, all right, we're going to use our custom plugin. And the configuration of any process plugin is this thing called source. And that's simply saying like, what's the source data that we want to pass in and transform? In our case, the state name. Hopefully that makes sense. So I'm going to go back, and when our process plugin is called, the transform function is actually the thing being called, and value is the thing that's getting passed in. So let's just say we wanted to return value. Nothing would happen here, right? We're simply getting value, which in our case is the state name, and we're returning that same state name. So nothing's changing. But we want to do something with it. All the states that start with new, they're no longer new anymore, right? They're old. States are not new anymore. I'm just being silly. This is a dumb example, but in this case, we're doing a simple PHP string replace, and we're going to replace any state that has new in the title of it with old. All right, remember any changes we make here, we need to clear a cache. And then we need to run that migration again, of course, with the update flag this time. So let's go back to our data. We can see like New York, New Jersey, New Mexico. So we're going to run our migration and refresh our data here. And we should, if we're lucky, we now have Old Hampshire, Old Jersey, Old Mexico. Silly example, but hopefully shows the power of process plugins. All right, let's take a look at actually generating one of those. So I'm going to type in lando drush generate. And I'm going to look in the plugin section, and I'm going to, here we've got a process plugin. So what's cool about this is we can just do lando drush generate, and then say we want to generate a process plugin. I'm going to use our webinar migrate module. So it makes you choose what module you're using, give it a unique identifier. So I'll just say webinar migrate example process. It doesn't have to be that long. It can be whatever you want. You can change the class name if you want. Again, those get into like things that may be specific to your style or your project. I'm not going to inject any dependencies in this case because we're keeping things very simple. And there you have it. It automatically creates the file and then puts it in the right place. You can say we have a new file called example process. And you can see by default, it's doing exactly what I mentioned, right? It's just returning value. So this want to actually transform anything in this case. So let's figure out what we want to do. Okay. Let's replace all spaces and remove the space. Actually, let's make it into a dash. So very simple again, we're just doing a string replace. I need to copy our identifier, right? And then let's head back over to this file. And what's cool about this is we can chain these process plugins. So you can actually just keep going. You can add as many as you want. And you'll notice one omission I have this time is I'm not going to specify source. Because if you do, it stops the chain reaction here. What happens is if you here at the beginning, we say state is our source, we transform here, and then that transform value gets passed into our next plugin. If we were to state source again here, that would ruin that. All right, so let's quickly clear cache again and run that. So process plugins are awesome. I hope that's a simple enough example. But basically, like anytime you want to transform your data you're migrating in, process plugins are the way to go. All right, so we'll update this real quick. If we refresh here, it should smush together any states that have multiple names. Or excuse me, put the dash in there. So that all seems to be working exactly how we wanted it to. All right, let's keep this train moving. So that's migrating from a CSV. I think the big difference is if you had a large CSV file, you would just have a lot of fields defined here. And then maybe the same, if you're migrating into a content type with many fields, that would look different. All right, so migrating from, let's say, Drupal 7. So there's a lot of examples from migrating from Drupal 7. A lot of them assume that you're migrating the entire site, which, in a lot of cases, I don't want to migrate everything over. Like data structures may be changing and whatnot. And I don't want to assume that I want the whole migration. So going this route allows me to really be specific about what I wanted to migrate over from my old site. Not much to talk about here in terms of setup. One thing I'll mention is that in my local settings file, I set up a migrate D7 database, and I migrated my Drupal 7 database there. And you can see that it has, if you're used to Drupal, right, it would be like default. And this time around, I gave it a key of migrate. And that's kind of the default. It assumes that if you're using that key, that's where your like migration data is coming from. that is a definable thing. I think you can change that like in your oh, I think in your let's see here. I'm not making a complete sentence at the moment. Let's look at our migrate file here. I think you can define your data, like which database uh, key to use somewhere in one of these files. You can do a Google search for that, I'm sure. All right, so this again looks very familiar. This time we're using a D7 node process plugin. This is very specific. This means that you have a D7 database connected. And in our case, we have a node type from Drupal 7 called story. Again, same deal here. On the left are our Drupal 10 field names or properties. I've added a couple in here just to show that example. The Git plugin is pretty similar to simply just straight up like hard coding the value like that and not using a plugin at all. Just to be clear, it does in certain cases it does some nice stuff when coming over from Drupal 7, so it's kind of encouraged to use it. But you'll notice we don't have fields defined because this plugin is automatically, it queries all our Drupal 7 fields for us, which is super nice. Because you can see down here, like I am migrating in like our body field into our body field in Drupal 10. Here's a process plugin that I believe comes with Drupal core. It's called default value. And you can see that I've set that to full HTML. So in the case where you need to like hard code a value, that's super handy. And then our destination, you can see I'm doing entity node into a bundle of article. What's cool is you can easily go from like a node in Drupal 7 to a taxonomy. So if you had to, it's super easy. You would just simply change that over and you could, you can migrate like the node title in Drupal 7 into the vocabulary name in Drupal 10. There's nothing preventing you from doing that. All right, so what's cool is like, this is simple. This is it. There's no other code here except for this YAML file in this case. And I can do lando drush migrate status. And you can see that we have 4,000 items that are coming over. I'm going to go ahead and get that running here. This is where a migration becomes super powerful, right? Like it just want to be humanly possible. Well, it would be. It would just take forever to do that manually. And you can see it just cruises right along here. You could set up as many of these as you need, right? So we could make a copy of this file, change the content type name, the destination, and you would be off to the races. So sometimes, like, if you want to be more prescriptive about what's coming over from your Drupal 7 site, this is a great way of handling that. All right, while that's running, the last thing I'll touch on is like migrating from a custom MySQL database. So that's where we would define our own source. Again, I did this with the drush generate command. Just a couple things I'll note here. This is pretty straightforward. So a lot of the methods here are generated out of the box or, come from this SQL-based class that we're extending. Drupal set all this up for me. And then all I needed to do was define, this uses whatever database is defined here with the migrate key. So I've given it a table name. You list out all the fields that you want to actually be available to your migration. You define those fields here. So this is kind of like where you do your select query, and then where you define your fields, and then where you define your unique identifier in that source data. So what you were seeing earlier that is provided directly in the YAML file, we actually have to do in code here. But it's not too hard, right? This is a real simple database table. It had two columns, name and value. And then lastly, you'll see this prepare row method. Basically in prepare row, like anything that you can do in a process plugin, you can do in prepare row. I just find process plugins to be way more useful and reusable. All right, and then to run that migration, the custom one that we have defined, the only difference this time, right, is we reference our custom source plugin process. All works exactly the same way. So does destination. But you can see that all 4,000 of our nodes came over into Drupal 10 in a matter of like less than a minute.